Marcus Thompson had always been the class clown. At 23, he still believed that making people laugh was his greatest talent. Working as a delivery driver in London gave him plenty of opportunities to crack jokes with customers, and he loved the attention it brought him. His friends often warned him that his pranks were getting out of hand, but Marcus never listened. He thought he was invincible, especially when it came to getting a good laugh. On that crisp Tuesday morning, in October, Marcus was making his regular delivery rounds through the wealthy districts of London. His small van was packed with expensive tea packages destined for high-end hotels and restaurants. The autumn air was fresh, and Marcus was in an unusually good mood. He had just received a text from his girlfriend, Sarah, telling him she had great news to share when he got home. Life seemed perfect, and he felt like nothing could go wrong. As he drove past Buckingham Palace, Marcus noticed the usual crowd of tourists gathering to watch the changing of the guard ceremony. Traffic was moving slowly due to the crowds, giving him plenty of time to observe the scene. The royal guard stood perfectly still in their iconic red uniforms and tall black hats, their faces showing no emotion whatsoever. Marcus had always found their serious demeanor amusing. He often joked with his friends about how these guards were like living statues, completely immune to any distraction. While waiting in traffic, Marcus spotted a particular guard standing near the palace gates. The young man appeared to be around Marcus's age, with a stern expression that seemed almost comical to him. Tourists were taking photos, trying to make the guard smile or react, but he remained completely motionless. Marcus found this incredibly entertaining and began to form what he thought was a brilliant idea for a harmless prank. In the back of his van, several packages of premium Earl Grey tea had broken open during transport. The loose tea leaves were scattered across the floor, mixed with some spilled water from a leaking bottle. Marcus looked at the muddy tea mixture and then back at the stoic guard. His mischievous mind began to work, and he convinced himself that splashing a little tea on the guard would be the perfect harmless joke. After all, it was just tea and water, nothing that could really hurt anyone. Marcus parked his van illegally near the palace area, ignoring the no-stopping signs. He grabbed a paper cup from his dashboard and scooped up some of the tea mixture from the van floor. The liquid was brown and murky, looking more like dirty water than actual tea. He walked confidently toward the guard, his heart racing with excitement about the reaction he expected to get from the crowd. In his mind, everyone would laugh, the guard might crack a smile, and he would become the hero of the day. The guard, Sergeant William Hayes, had been serving in the Queen's Guard for 3 years. He took his duty seriously and had undergone rigorous training to maintain his composure under any circumstances. William had dealt with countless tourists trying to make him break character, from silly faces to loud noises, but he had never encountered anything like what was about to happen. He stood perfectly still, focused on his responsibilities, completely unaware of the approaching trouble. Marcus approached the guard with a wide grin on his face. The crowd of tourists began to notice him, some pointing and whispering about what the strange man with the cup might be planning. A few people started recording with their phones, sensing that something interesting was about to happen. Marcus felt the attention and loved every second of it. He was about to become famous, or so he thought. Without any hesitation or second thought about the consequences, Marcus threw the entire contents of the cup directly at Sergeant Hayes. The murky tea mixture splashed across the guard's pristine red uniform, staining the expensive fabric and dripping down onto his polished black boots. The crowd gasped in shock and disbelief. Some tourists stopped recording, realizing they had just witnessed something serious rather than funny. Sergeant Hayes remained motionless for exactly 3 seconds, as he had been trained to do. However, the assault on a member of the Queen's Guard was a serious criminal offense, and protocol demanded immediate action. Within moments, his fellow guards and nearby police officers who were monitoring the area sprang into action. Marcus's smile began to fade as he realized that nobody was laughing. Instead, he saw anger, shock, and disappointment in the faces around him. The reality of what he had just done started to sink in, but it was already too late to take it back. The silence that followed Marcus's action lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. The tourist crowd, which had been chattering and taking photos moments before, now stood in stunned silence. Children who had been laughing and pointing at the colorful guard suddenly hid behind their parents. The atmosphere around Buckingham Palace had changed completely, from one of joy and excitement to tension and fear. Two armed police officers who had been stationed nearby immediately moved toward Marcus. Their hands instinctively moved to their weapons as they assessed the situation. In today's world, any unexpected action near royal property was treated as a potential security threat. Marcus raised his hands in the air, finally understanding that this was not going to end with laughter and applause as he had imagined. His face turned pale as he saw the serious expressions of the approaching officers. Detective Inspector Sarah Mitchell was having her morning coffee in the security office when the radio crackled with reports of an incident at the main gate. She had been working royal protection for 8 years and had seen everything from harmless pranks to serious security threats. However, something about this call made her put down her coffee immediately and rush outside. The description of a man throwing liquid at a guard triggered all her professional alarm bells. Marcus tried to explain himself to the officers as they surrounded him. His words came out in a rush, desperate and panicked. He kept repeating that it was just a harmless joke, and that he never meant to hurt anyone. But the officers were not interested in his explanations. They had protocols to follow, and any assault on royal property required immediate detention and investigation. Marcus found himself being handcuffed within minutes of his supposed prank. Sergeant Hayes, still maintaining his position despite the stained uniform, was quickly replaced by another guard. The ceremony continued as if nothing had happened, but behind the scenes, a complex investigation was already beginning. The palace security team needed to determine whether this was an isolated incident by a foolish individual or part of something more sinister. In the current security climate, they could not afford to take any chances. The crowd of tourists began to disperse, many of them sharing videos and photos of the incident on social media. Within hours, Marcus's face would be plastered across news websites and social media platforms around the world. What he thought would be a moment of harmless fun was turning into a global news story. The hashtag #Teagate scandal began trending on Twitter before Marcus even reached the police station. As Marcus was led away in handcuffs, he caught sight of his delivery van being towed. The parking tickets on his windshield were the least of his problems now. His employer would soon learn about the incident, and his job would certainly be in jeopardy. More importantly, he began to realize that attacking a member of the Queen's Guard was likely a serious criminal offense with severe penalties. Detective Inspector Mitchell began her preliminary investigation by interviewing witnesses. The tourists, who had captured the incident on their phones, were eager to share their footage. The videos clearly showed Marcus approaching the guard with deliberate intent and throwing the liquid without any provocation. There was no ambiguity about what had happened or who was responsible. At the police station, Marcus was processed like any other criminal suspect. His fingerprints were taken, his photo was captured, and his personal belongings were catalogued. The duty sergeant explained his rights, but Marcus was too shocked to fully comprehend what was happening to him. He kept asking to call his girlfriend Sarah, but was told he would have to wait until the initial processing was complete. The charge sheet was being prepared, and Marcus learned for the first time the serious nature of his offense. Saul On-e, a member of the Royal Guard, was classified under the Public Order Act, with potential penalties including substantial fines and imprisonment. The prosecutor would also likely pursue charges under anti-terrorism legislation, as any attack on royal property was now treated with extreme seriousness. Marcus's girlfriend Sarah was at work when she received the shocking phone call. At first, she thought someone was playing a cruel joke on her. The Marcus she knew was silly and immature, but he would never do something this serious. As the reality sank in, she realized that the great news she had planned to share with him that evening would have to wait. She was 3 months pregnant and had been planning to surprise him with the news over a romantic dinner. News outlets began picking up the story, and Marcus's name was released to the media. His photograph, taken during his arrest, appeared on news websites alongside headlines describing him as the man who attacked a royal guard. His family members started receiving calls from reporters, all wanting to know more about the man who had committed such a bizarre and serious crime against the crown. Marcus spent his first night in a holding cell, unable to sleep as the reality of his situation continued to sink in. The small, cold room was nothing like the comfortable bed he had woken up in just 24 hours earlier. His cellmate, a man arrested for shoplifting, looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and disdain when he learned what Marcus had done. Even petty criminals, it seemed, had more respect for the royal family than Marcus had shown. The next morning brought Marcus's first meeting with a duty solicitor, James Crawford. Crawford had been practicing criminal law for 15 years and had seen many foolish decisions lead to serious consequences. But Marcus's case was particularly striking in its sheer stupidity. As he reviewed the evidence, including multiple video recordings from different angles, Crawford realized that building a defense would be extremely challenging. Marcus pleaded with his solicitor to make the charges go away, insisting repeatedly that it was just a joke gone wrong. Crawford patiently explained that the law does not recognize good intentions when it comes to assaulting members of the Royal Guard. The fact that Marcus used tea instead of something more harmful would not absolve him of criminal responsibility. The prosecutor would argue that any liquid thrown at a guard could have been dangerous, and the courts would likely agree. Sarah visited Marcus at the police station, and their meeting was heartbreaking for both of them. She had dark circles under her eyes from crying and lack of sleep. When Marcus saw her distressed state, his own emotional walls began to crumble. He apologized repeatedly, but Sarah struggled to understand how the man she loved could have done something so thoughtless and destructive to their future together. During their brief conversation, Sarah decided not to tell Marcus about her pregnancy. The stress of his arrest and impending trial would be enough for him to handle without the additional pressure of knowing he was going to be a father. She also was not sure if she wanted to raise a child with someone who had shown such poor judgment. The future she had imagined for them was now uncertain and frightening. Detective Inspector Mitchell's investigation expanded as she delved deeper into Marcus's background. She discovered that he had been involved in several minor incidents over the past few years, including a warning from his previous employer about inappropriate behavior with customers. While none of these incidents were criminal, they painted a picture of someone who consistently pushed boundaries without considering consequences. The media coverage intensified as more details about Marcus emerged. Reporters tracked down his former classmates, co-workers, and neighbors, all eager to share stories about his history of pranks and attention-seeking behavior. The narrative that emerged was not sympathetic. Marcus was portrayed as a grown man who had never learned to take responsibility for his actions, and who had finally pushed too far. Marcus's delivery company immediately terminated his employment and issued a public statement distancing themselves from his actions. They emphasized that Marcus had been acting completely outside his job duties and that his behavior did not reflect the company's values. The statement also mentioned that they were considering legal action against him for damaging their reputation and losing several important client contracts. His parents, Robert and Linda Thompson, were devastated by the news. They had raised Marcus to be respectful and responsible, and could not understand where they had gone wrong. Robert, a retired teacher, felt particularly ashamed because he had spent his career trying to instill proper values in young people. Linda, a nurse, was horrified that her son had caused distress to someone who was simply doing his job. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following week, and Crawford explained to Marcus that the prosecution was likely to push for the maximum penalty to make an example of him. With the current security concerns around royal properties, the courts were taking a very hard line on any form of assault or threatening behavior. Marcus could face up to 6 months in prison and a substantial fine. Sergeant Hayes, meanwhile, was dealing with his own challenges. While physically unharmed, he was required to undergo counseling to ensure that the incident had not affected his ability to perform his duties. The uniform that Marcus had stained was a ceremonial piece worth hundreds of pounds, which would need to be replaced at considerable expense. Hayes also had to endure teasing from some of his fellow soldiers, though most supported him and were angry about what had happened. The palace released a brief statement expressing support for Sergeant Hayes and emphasizing that attacks on royal guards would be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. The statement was carefully worded to avoid giving the incident more attention than necessary, but it made clear that such behavior would not be tolerated under any circumstances. Marcus began to understand that his moment of supposed humor had triggered a chain of events that would affect not only his own life, but the lives of everyone who cared about him. Sarah was struggling at work, unable to concentrate while dealing with both her boyfriend's arrest and her secret pregnancy. His parents were facing embarrassment in their community, where the story had become local news. Even his former co-workers were being questioned by reporters about his character and behavior. The courthouse on the morning of Marcus's preliminary hearing was surrounded by reporters and photographers. What should have been a routine legal proceeding had become a media circus, with news vans lining the street and journalists jostling for position. Marcus had to be escorted through a side entrance to avoid the crowds, but even so, cameras captured his pale, frightened face as he entered the building that would determine his fate. Judge Margaret Harrison had been presiding over criminal cases for 12 years, and she had developed a reputation for fairness combined with a no-nonsense approach to justice. As she reviewed Marcus's file before the hearing, she noted his clean criminal record, but was troubled by the pattern of immature behavior that had led to this moment. The seriousness of attacking a royal guard, regardless of the weapon used, demanded careful consideration. The prosecution, led by Crown Prosecutor David Sterling, presented a compelling case that emphasized the security implications of Marcus's actions. Sterling argued that in an era of heightened security concerns, any assault on royal property must be treated with maximum seriousness. He presented video evidence showing Marcus's deliberate approach and attack, emphasizing that the guard had no way of knowing whether the liquid contained harmful chemicals or other dangerous substances. Marcus's solicitor, Crawford, attempted to present his client as a misguided young man who had made a terrible error in judgment rather than a genuine security threat. He emphasized Marcus's lack of criminal history and his genuine remorse for his actions. However, Crawford privately knew that his arguments were unlikely to result in leniency, given the current political climate and public pressure for tough sentences in cases involving royal security. Sarah sat in the public gallery, her hands protectively placed over her still flat stomach. She watched as the man she loved was described by the prosecutor as reckless and dangerous. The Marcus being discussed in court seemed like a stranger to her. She had fallen in love with his sense of humor and spontaneous nature, but now those same qualities were being presented as character flaws that made him a threat to society. The hearing revealed additional consequences that Marcus had not anticipated. The palace security team had been forced to review and strengthen their protocols following his attack, resulting in significant costs and disruption. Tourist visits had been temporarily reduced, while new security measures were implemented, affecting local businesses that depended on tourism revenue. Marcus's single act of supposed humor had created a ripple effect of problems throughout the community. During a brief recess, Marcus finally learned about Sarah's pregnancy when she could no longer keep the secret. The news should have been the happiest moment of his life, but instead it added another layer of devastation to his situation. He realized that his actions had not only destroyed his own future, but had also jeopardized the future of his unborn child. Sarah was sobbing as she told him, explaining that she was terrified about raising a baby alone if he went to prison. Judge Harrison listened carefully to both sides before delivering her decision. She acknowledged Marcus's lack of criminal intent, but emphasized that the law must protect those who serve the crown. The judge pointed out that royal guards cannot defend themselves while on duty, making attacks against them particularly serious. She also noted that the incident had required significant resources to investigate and had disrupted important security operations. Marcus was remanded in custody pending sentencing, which would take place in 2 weeks after a full pre-sentence report was completed. As he was led away in handcuffs, he caught sight of Sarah's tear-stained face in the gallery. The weight of what he had done to their lives together finally hit him completely. The baby she was carrying would be born while his or her father was possibly in prison, all because of 30 seconds of incredibly poor judgment. The media coverage following the hearing was extensive and largely negative. Marcus was portrayed as an example of declining respect for authority and tradition. Social media was filled with comments calling for harsh punishment and criticizing what many saw as a generation that had lost respect for important institutions. The incident had touched a nerve with the public, who viewed the attack on the Royal Guard as an attack on British values themselves. His parents visited him in custody that evening, and the meeting was painful for all of them. Linda Thompson could barely speak through her tears, while Robert struggled to understand how his son had become front-page news for all the wrong reasons. They had always been proud of Marcus, despite his immature tendencies, but now they were facing the possibility that their son would have a criminal record and their grandchild would be born into a family marked by scandal. Marcus spent his second night in custody writing a letter to Sarah, trying to explain his feelings and apologize for destroying their future together. He wrote about his regret, his fear, and his desperate love for both her and their unborn child. However, he struggled to find words that could adequately express the depth of his remorse or provide any real comfort to the woman whose life he had turned upside down with his thoughtless actions. The pre-sentence report would require interviews with Marcus, his family, and character witnesses. The probation officer assigned to his case, Patricia Williams, had 25 years of experience assessing offenders and making recommendations to judges. As she began her evaluation, she was struck by the disconnect between Marcus's genuine remorse and his complete failure to consider consequences before acting. Her report would play a crucial role in determining whether Marcus faced immediate imprisonment or might receive a suspended sentence that would allow him to be present for his child's birth. Patricia Williams had interviewed hundreds of offenders during her career, but Marcus Thompson presented a unique challenge. During their first meeting at the detention center, she observed a young man who seemed genuinely shocked by the consequences of his actions. Marcus spoke openly about his history of pranks and attention-seeking behavior, admitting that he had never stopped to consider how his actions might affect other people until now. The probation officer's investigation into Marcus's background revealed a pattern of increasingly risky behavior that his family and friends had dismissed as harmless fun. His former teachers described him as a bright student who was constantly seeking approval through inappropriate humor. Former employers reported that while Marcus was hardworking, his practical jokes often created tension in the workplace and made customers uncomfortable. Sarah's pregnancy was progressing normally, but the stress of the situation was taking its toll on her health. Her doctor had warned her about the risks of excessive stress during pregnancy and had recommended counseling to help her cope with the uncertainty about Marcus's future. She was torn between her love for him and her anger about his selfishness in putting their family at risk for the sake of a moment's entertainment. The pre-sentence report also included interviews with Sergeant Hayes, who surprised everyone with his measured and thoughtful responses. Rather than calling for harsh punishment, Hayes expressed hope that Marcus would learn from his mistake and become a productive member of society. He emphasized that while the incident had been serious and disruptive, he believed Marcus was not truly dangerous and deserved a chance to redeem himself. Marcus's family rallied around him despite their disappointment and embarrassment. His parents attended every court appearance and visited him regularly in custody. Robert Thompson wrote a powerful character reference describing his son's good qualities and taking responsibility for perhaps not teaching him enough about considering consequences. Linda Thompson's letter focused on Marcus's capacity for love and growth, using her medical background to argue that young adults' brains are still developing impulse control. The media attention gradually shifted from outrage to analysis of broader social issues. Some commentators used Marcus's case to discuss the role of social media in encouraging attention-seeking behavior, while others examined the pressures facing young adults in modern society. A few sympathetic voices emerged, arguing that while Marcus's actions were inexcusable, the punishment should fit both the crime and the individual circumstances. Crawford worked tirelessly to prepare for the sentencing hearing, gathering character references and evidence of Marcus's genuine remorse. He arranged for Marcus to write a formal apology letter to Sergeant Hayes, the palace security team, and the royal family. The letter was carefully crafted to express sincere regret, without appearing to minimize the seriousness of his actions or make excuses for his behavior. 2 days before the sentencing hearing, Marcus received devastating news that would change everything. Sarah had been admitted to the hospital with complications related to her pregnancy. The stress of the situation, combined with her body's reaction to constant anxiety, had triggered early contractions. Doctors were working to prevent premature labor, but warned that the baby's health was now at risk. Crawford immediately petitioned the court for permission for Marcus to visit Sarah in the hospital under guard supervision. The request was controversial, as it was unusual to grant such privileges to someone awaiting sentencing for a serious offense. However, Judge Harrison agreed to allow a brief, supervised visit after considering the exceptional circumstances and the potential impact on both Sarah and the unborn child. The visit to the hospital was heartbreaking for both Marcus and Sarah. She was connected to monitoring equipment, and the sound of their baby's irregular heartbeat filled the room. Marcus sat beside her bed, holding her hand while two security guards watched from the corner. They both cried as they discussed the possibility that their child might be born prematurely because of the stress caused by his actions. Sarah finally told Marcus how she really felt about what he had done. Through her tears, she explained that while she still loved him, she was struggling to forgive him for putting their family at risk. She talked about the sleepless nights, the anxiety attacks, and the fear that their child would grow up with a father in prison. Her words hit Marcus harder than any legal punishment could have. During that hospital visit, Marcus experienced a moment of clarity that had been building since his arrest. He realized that his entire adult life had been focused on getting attention and making people laugh, without any regard for the consequences or the feelings of others. Sarah's pregnancy complications were a direct result of his selfishness, and he understood that he needed to fundamentally change who he was as a person. The doctors managed to stop Sarah's premature contractions, but she remained in the hospital under observation. Marcus was returned to custody, but the experience had transformed him in a way that weeks of counseling and legal proceedings had not. He spent his final night before sentencing writing in a journal, documenting his thoughts and promising himself that he would become the kind of man his child could be proud of. Patricia Williams completed her pre-sentence report with mixed feelings. Her professional assessment was that Marcus posed minimal risk of reoffending and showed genuine remorse for his actions. However, she also noted that he had demonstrated extremely poor judgment and a troubling pattern of failing to consider consequences. Her recommendation would balance the need for punishment with the potential for rehabilitation, while considering the welfare of both Marcus's unborn child and the broader public interest. The courthouse was once again filled with reporters on the morning of Marcus's sentencing, but this time the atmosphere was different. News of Sarah's pregnancy complications had leaked to the media, adding a human element to the story that had previously been dominated by discussions of security and punishment. Some of the coverage had become more sympathetic, focusing on the tragic consequences that Marcus's moment of poor judgment had brought upon his young family. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom with the weight of a difficult decision on her shoulders. She had spent considerable time reviewing Marcus's case, the pre-sentence report, and the numerous character references submitted on his behalf. The legal precedent called for a custodial sentence, but the exceptional circumstances of Sarah's pregnancy and the genuine nature of Marcus's remorse complicated the matter significantly. Marcus stood in the dock wearing his best suit, which his mother had brought to the courthouse. His face showed the strain of the past few weeks, and he appeared to have aged years in just a short time. Sarah was not present, as she was still hospitalized, but his parents sat in the gallery along with Crawford and several family friends, who had come to show their support. Crown Prosecutor Sterling made his final arguments for immediate imprisonment, emphasizing that the security of royal properties and personnel could not be compromised by lenient sentencing. He argued that Marcus's actions, regardless of his intentions, had required significant resources to investigate and had disrupted important security operations. The prosecutor maintained that only a custodial sentence would serve as an adequate deterrent to others who might consider similar actions. Crawford delivered an impassioned plea for mercy, focusing on the extraordinary circumstances surrounding Marcus's case. He presented evidence of Marcus's genuine transformation during his time in custody, including testimony from prison chaplains and counselors who had worked with him. Crawford emphasized that Marcus's unborn child should not be punished for his father's mistakes, and argued that a suspended sentence with community service would better serve both justice and society. Judge Harrison began her sentencing remarks by acknowledging the seriousness of Marcus's offense and the legitimate security concerns it had raised. She noted that attacks on royal guards, regardless of the materials used, represented attacks on important British institutions that deserved protection. However, she also recognized the exceptional circumstances of the case and the evidence of Marcus's genuine remorse and potential for rehabilitation. The judge sentenced Marcus to 6 months imprisonment, suspended for 2 years, along with 200 hours of community service and a substantial fine. The suspended sentence meant that Marcus would not go to prison immediately, but would face imprisonment if he committed any further offenses during the 2-year period. The community service would involve working with organizations that supported military veterans, giving Marcus an opportunity to understand the service and sacrifice that people like Sergeant Hayes made for their country. Marcus broke down in tears when he heard the sentence, overwhelmed with relief that he would be able to be present for his child's birth and support Sarah through her recovery. His parents embraced him as soon as he was released from the dock, and all 3 of them cried together in the courthouse hallway. The suspended sentence represented not just legal mercy, but a second chance for Marcus to prove that he could become a better person. The media reaction to the sentence was mixed. Some criticized Judge Harrison for being too lenient, arguing that the suspended sentence failed to send a strong enough message about the seriousness of attacking royal property. Others praised the decision as a balanced approach that considered all the circumstances and focused on rehabilitation rather than purely punitive measures. The debate continued for several days before other news stories eventually took precedence. Marcus went directly from the courthouse to the hospital to see Sarah. She was stable, and the baby was no longer in immediate danger, but doctors warned that she would need to remain on bed rest for the remainder of her pregnancy. When Marcus walked into her hospital room as a free man, Sarah's relief was evident despite her ongoing anger and disappointment about his actions. Their conversation was difficult but necessary. Sarah explained that while she was grateful he would not be imprisoned, she needed time to rebuild her trust in him. She had realized during his time in custody that she had enabled some of his attention-seeking behavior by laughing at his pranks and not challenging him when his actions were inappropriate. Both of them needed to change if their relationship and family were going to survive. Marcus began his community service the following week, working at a center that provided support services for military veterans. The experience was humbling and educational, as he met men and women who had sacrificed their health, their relationships, and sometimes their mental well-being in service to their country. Many of the veterans he worked with had served alongside royal guards or in similar ceremonial roles, giving him a deeper understanding of the honor and responsibility involved in such positions. Sergeant Hayes, who had returned to his duties without incident, eventually agreed to meet with Marcus as part of his rehabilitation program. The meeting was arranged through official channels and took place at the military barracks under supervision. Hayes accepted Marcus's apology graciously and spoke about the pride he took in his service to the crown. The conversation helped Marcus understand that his attack had not just been on an individual, but on an institution that represented centuries of British tradition and service. Sarah gave birth to a healthy daughter 3 months later, with Marcus by her side throughout the labor and delivery. Holding his daughter for the first time, Marcus felt the full weight of responsibility for another human being's well-being. He made a silent promise to her that he would spend the rest of his life being the kind of father she deserved, someone who thought carefully about his actions and their consequences. 1 year after the incident, Marcus had completed his community service and was working as a volunteer coordinator for the Veterans Center where he had been assigned to serve. He had discovered a talent for organizing events and fundraising activities, channeling his desire for attention into positive community work. Sarah had returned to work part-time, and they were slowly rebuilding their relationship while raising their daughter together. The tea-staining incident became a cautionary tale that Marcus shared with young people during school visits organized by the probation service. He spoke honestly about how 30 seconds of poor judgment had nearly destroyed his life and endangered his family's future. His presentations were powerful because of their authenticity, and many students were shocked to see how quickly bad decisions could spiral out of control. Marcus learned that true maturity meant understanding that actions have consequences that extend far beyond the immediate moment. His daughter would grow up knowing the story of her father's mistake and redemption, and Marcus hoped that his experience would serve as a lesson about the importance of thinking before acting. The man who had once thought splashing tea on a royal guard would be funny had discovered that the most meaningful laughs come from joy and connection with others, not from humiliating or shocking people for attention.